we have been discussing about the various nuances of philosophy, the question of existence, to what exactly is the view of reality. And these themes have been introduced in this paper called Introduction to Philosophy for our DSc Semester 1 for the first years for the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College under the UGCF NEP syllabi. Today we continue talking about the theme different views of reality in this session. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, we have to understand that philosophy has a bigger picture. And when I say a bigger picture, we have to again take into cognizance that the text by Duncan Pritchard, what is this thing called philosophy, it is just not about memorizing facts, it is just not about mugging up the narratives or the various isms, it is again not about just a basic question and answer syllabus that one might be thinking. So the very question as to what is philosophy itself is a layered question. As such, Duncan Pritchard, who is one of the protagonists as a part of the essential reading series that we have in our syllabus, says that philosophy cannot be only about, or it is not only about memorizing facts. Rather, he states that philosophy is about questioning assumptions. It is also about clarifying concepts. Further, evaluating reasons and arguments are considered some of the key role of what philosophy does. So, philosophy can ask questions that science, religion, or common sense often take for granted. Secondly, two of the most fundamental philosophical areas, metaphysics and epistemology, are broadly studied. Now, metaphysics is to do with what is reality like. Epistemology, on the other hand, talks about how do we know anything about that reality. And metaphysics and epistemology together shape up the different views of reality. And our today's theme is about this very theme, which is entitled as the different views of reality. Needless to say, we are falling back upon metaphysics, upon epistemology. We are reviewing the questioning assumptions pre. We will be trying to engage into conceptual clarification and further evaluate reasons and arguments as our methodology. Now, first thing first, when we talk about metaphysics, we have to cite Christy Miller. Again, Christy Miller is one of the recommended texts in the syllabus. Now, for Christy Miller, when it comes to metaphysics, in simple terms, she says that metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that asks what exists and what it is like at the most for fundamental level to understand existence. She also says that metaphysics is not about opinions or fantasy. It is about the structure of reality itself. So, metaphysical questions ought to be separated from regular questions. Now, what are those questions that qualifies to be metaphysical? For instance, do objects really exist independently of us? Is time real or just a way we experience things? Are minds different from bodies? Do universals exist, like redness of a red tomato? Do they actually exist without their substance, the tomato? Or is it only about the existence of particular things, say the tomato, and not the redness? Miller is clear that there are competing pictures of reality. For example, the common sense realism. Now, what is this common sense realism? The common sense realism states that the world is roughly how it appears. Tables, chairs, people, they exist independently of us. That's a very, the naive or the common sense realism. On the other hand, there is also the scientific realism. What is to do with the scientific realism? They say that reality is best described by science. Even if we cannot see electrons or quarks, they are real, for they have been established by science and there is no going against them. So, for the scientific realism, science is the full stop. We also have what is called as idealism. Now, the scenario of reality vis-a-vis idealism is a little tricky. Under idealism, reality is considered to be fundamentally mental. Physical objects, they say, depend on minds to exist. The father of idealism is rightly said to be Bishop Berkeley, and he had come up with the tagline of Esse est percipi, which is to be is to be perceived. Now, to be here means to exist. What he said was the very core of existence is dependent on perception. So, the question that occurs is, you are perceiving me, I am perceiving you, so we are existing. But what about then certain, say, events or circumstances or objects that are beyond any perception? To give an instance, there could be some wildflowers blooming out there in the mountains that have never been gazed upon by the human eyes. The question is, do they stop to exist? Or is it the case that as and when we keep observing or keep perceiving the external object, they exist, the minute we stop gazing at them, they disappear? Is it how it works? The response that Bishop Berkeley gives us, it isn't this way or this simple. Rather, please understand, he comes from the discipline of theology. So his ultimate objective is to establish, prove the existence of God. So he says that individual perception is limited. Therefore, there has to be a universal perceiver. And this universal perceiver keeps on perceiving objects, events, things, past, present, future, and as such, they continue to exist. So, who is this universal perceiver? God. Thus, idealism is the other form of realism, and needless to say, it is heavily dependent on the mental real world. Now, the fourth form of realism is entitled as materialism or physicalism. If idealism is one extreme, materialism is the other extreme, or as the synonymous is physicalism. For them, everything that exists is physical. Minds are ultimately physical processes. None of these views, of course, we understand is correct. So basically, for physicalism, mind is reduced to brain, which is further reduced to neuroscientific processes, which is further reduced to neurons. So it is a reductive approach where they say that every physical object, including the mind, is nothing over and above being physical. And physical or materiality is, matter that subsists on its own. So there is no demand or there is no necessary condition for the mind or the non-material world to exist. As such, we have had the common sense realism that says that the world is how it is, the way it appears. Scientific realism says that the reality is best described by science. For example, water, they would say, is so because it is two molecules of hydrogen and one molecule H2O, two molecules of oxygen and one molecule of hydrogen, and that's how they would define water. Similarly, they would talk about carbon monoxide as CO. So that is how they see the reality of things as. Idealism, as I had just about mentioned, starting from Bishop Berkeley, says that all the states that exist are dependent mentally. As long as they are being perceived, objects exist. And the fourth one has been called as physicalism, where they say that physical matters, physical events, physical objects exist. There is no two arguments on that. However, even the so-called mental states or mind is nothing but reduced to brain processes. In a way, they are also physical in their argumentation. But as just have been mentioned, none of these views is obviously correct. Metaphysics compares them using arguments, not experiments. So this is precisely where why metaphysics matter. And Miller stresses that metaphysics shapes how we understand ourselves. Metaphysics influences ethics, science, and religion. Metaphysics determines what we think is possible. If reality is purely physical, free will might look very different than if minds are non-physical. And who helps us to understand these? Miller stresses that it has to be metaphysics. Now, it is hoped that by the time we end this section, one should be able to at least have a basic understanding of how to define metaphysics, explain what philosophers mean by reality, should be in a position to identify at least two competing metaphysical views, if not more, and should be in a position to understand why metaphysical disagreements matter. With this very basic introduction of metaphysics, we have rightly said that there is also the theory of epistemology. And with epistemology, we are largely referring to Duncan Pritchard's work, What is Knowledge? Now, epistemology asks questions like, what is knowledge? And how do we get it? Pritchard focuses on everyday knowledge. For example, I know the earth orbits the sun. I know I have hands. I know my friend is trustworthy. So all these statements, I know that so and so, or I know this is so and so, these are nothing but to do with knowledge statements, which are called as epistemological statements. So epistemology belongs to the domain of knowledge. But Pritchard also shows that these claims can be philosophically puzzling. Traditionally, the classical definition of knowledge is defined as JTB, which is justified true belief. So, to know something, it is said that it must be true, we must believe it, and we must have good reasons or justifications to believe it. And Pritchard explains this carefully, and then of course he shows that it is not enough. The traditional JTB, or the justified true belief, is just not sufficient, and he flags the Edmund Gettier problem, popularly called as the Gettier problem. Now, to quickly revisit the Gettier problem, philosophers discovered certain cases where someone did have a justified true belief, but it still didn't feel like knowledge. This revealed that knowledge is more complex than we thought. So Pritchard uses this to show that philosophy progresses by counterexamples. Even basic concepts need careful analysis. We also have this ism called skepticism. Now, what is skepticism? Skepticism says that, can we really know anything? A central epistemological challenge that comes from skepticism is, how do we know we are not being deceived? And when I'm talking about deception here, let's recollect the Cartesian dualism, the three famous arguments, the dream argument, the demon argument, the argument from sense perception. So, example, in our dreams, we just do not know whether we are dreaming that a tiger is attacking me and I am sweating and my heartbeat is palpitating, or it is actually happening. The line is blurred here between our Jagrata and our Sushupti, or our sleeping state, and our waking state, the Swapna state. The demon argument, or the brain in a vat scenario, where we assume that 2 plus 2 is 4, but as per René Descartes, what if there is this evil demon that has been configured in our system that is making me believe that 2 plus 2 is 4? Maybe it is something else. How do we know about that? How do we go about that? These are nothing but the skeptical positions. We also have the argument from perception, where they say that whatever we perceive needn't really be the right form of knowledge. Sometimes our very senses can deceive us. For instance, when I insert a stick inside water, that stick seems bent, but when I take it out, it is a straight stick. So who deceived whom? Of course, it's a case of rarefaction and everything, but perceptions, our sense perceptions, are also deceptive. Thus, Pritchard argues that skepticism forces us to clarify what counts as evidence, to rethink how knowledge relates to certainty. Now, in epistemology, we hope that by the end of, we are through with the epistemological section of the views, the different views of reality, one should be able to explain what epistemology studies, describe the traditional definition of knowledge, understand why Gettier cases are important, and explain what philosophical skepticism is all about. Now, the first question first. How are epistemology and metaphysics connected? This will be the key unifying idea in our lecture today. As told, metaphysics asks, what is the world like? Epistemology, on the other hand, asks, how can we know what the world is like? Different metaphysical views require different epistemological approaches. So, it isn't the case that this is one metaphysical view and that particular epistemological approach would work. It needn't, it may not. And what worked before, there is no guarantee that it will work out in the future too. For example, if reality is mind independent, perception must be reliable. If reality is mind dependent, knowledge may come from reflection rather than observation. If skepticism is true, metaphysical claims become unstable. So, our view of reality affects what we think knowledge is possible. Thus, the question then is, why do philosophers disagree? Pritchard emphasizes that philosophy rarely ends with final answers. In philosophy, where values arguments over authority, and philosophy encourages intellectual humility. So, disagreement is not a failure, it is just a method, and this is important to understand, where disagreements are seen, or someone who disagrees and is not able to prove further is seen with a smirk. Philosophers would say that this is exactly how philosophy progresses. There will be agreement, there will be disagreement. There will be thesis, there will be antithesis. And in between thesis and antithesis, there will come out the method called synthesis. So, disagreements are necessary for philosophy to progress, for philosophy to expand. Now, if we look at the PPT here, we see that this is where the big map is. Philosophy, the big map, what is real, epistemology is all about what is knowledge. So philosophy, basically when we talk about the question of reality, splits into different branches. However, they are interconnected. Now when we talk about metaphysics, we see that there can be different views of reality. The common sense realism, which we had already talked about, that objects appear as they are. There is no rocket science to understand that. Scientific realism, that talks about that science has the final say. Whatever, however science defines, that remains as the real objects or the real events. Materialism or physicalism states that all the objects or the events that exist are material or physical in nature, and even non-material like mind is reduced to brain states or to further neuroreductive processes. And we also have the fourth view of reality, which is called as idealism, and that was taken forward by Bishop Berkeley, whose philosophy was esse est percipi, or the to exist is to be perceived. And quickly we see that the common sense theory says that things are how they look. Scientific is science tells us what is real. Materialism is only physical stuff exists, and idealism states that mind comes first. Now, metaphysics, the questions that it asks us: what exists, what is time, what is mind, and so on. So metaphysics is about the structure of reality and not opinion. Similarly, about epistemology, it questions what knowledge is, and basically the traditional classical version of knowledge was considered to be JTB, or the justified true belief, which is the traditional definition where knowledge was equivalent to justified true belief. That is a belief that is qualified with the truth factor and further qualified with enough evidence or justification was considered knowledge. For example, I know that I have an opinion, or rather I have a belief that I have an 8:50 a.m. class. I check the calendar, I check my timetable, and I see that it is a true belief, and further I go and attend the class and I see the teacher taking the class, the students being present, and I realize it is a justified true belief. So in knowledge, every belief first starts with a subjective approach, but then it becomes objective when it is being added with the truth factor and the justification factor. We had also talked about the Gettier problem, why knowledge is tricky, that JTB is there, but it cannot still hold ground for even when all these three boxes are ticked. Philosophers show that something can still go wrong. That is, we may have a true belief, it could be a justified belief, but there is no guarantee that it will give us valid knowledge. And this is where skepticism crops up. So skepticism says, the very challenge is to know how do I think I know? Am I dreaming? Am I being deceived? That is not to deny knowledge, but to test how strong our reasons really are. So though skepticism might be taken with a pinch of salt, but skepticism is needed for us to filter any such ifs and buts which might act as a block to gain knowledge. Further, we also have in this last PPT how metaphysics and epistemology are interconnected. That is, what is real, if that is metaphysics. By epistemology, we know that we discuss how can I know it. So our views of reality would affect what we think knowledge is possible. So metaphysics starts first, followed by epistemology, and there is a happy interconnection between the two. We will be continuing further in our next class about the interconnection of reality. Thank you.